She cleaned their house for 17 years. They never saw her, until the day she was accused of stealing what was already gone. The CEO had secrets, but Big Shaq had receipts. What started as a whisper would unravel a millionaire's empire, and the woman they tried to erase became the truth they couldn't ignore. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. At the crest of Hawthorne Ridge, past the iron-gated entrance that hummed quietly open each morning, sat the Grant estate, a glass and stone marvel, nestled in manicured silence. The home was large without apology, surrounded by trimmed hedges, whispering fountains, and the kind of stillness that only money could maintain. But within that fortress of wealth, long before the espresso machines hissed or the startup stocks fluctuated, one person began her day, in complete solitude: Clarice Holden. Clarice arrived before dawn. Always did. 17 years had trained her feet to move without thought, her hands to polish memory from surfaces, her presence to remain nearly invisible. She stepped from her second-hand Dodge onto the driveway that curved like a serpent up to the marble entrance. The morning mist still clung to the flower beds, dew catching on her shoes as she walked. Her uniform was pressed, hair pulled back into a low bun. She never carried a phone when she entered the house, didn't believe in distractions on someone else's time. The kitchen lights flickered on, at 5:47 a.m., and Clarice began where she always began, with the counters. Granite tops wiped to perfection, dishes loaded, unload, restocked. Sterling Grant, the owner of the estate, liked his kitchen like he liked his public image. Spotless, modern, curated. Clarice knew which cups he reached for without thinking, which drawers he never opened, which stains he wouldn't see but would mention if left alone. She knew his son, Carter, liked blueberry waffles but only if they were crispy. She knew Miss Grant never left her lipstick print on the coffee mug. She drank with a straw, even at home. These weren't just habits, they were pieces of a life Clarice had helped keep from unraveling for nearly 2 decades. She never complained. Not when Christmas bonuses disappeared, or when her hours were cut to accommodate another minimalist remodel. Not when Sterling introduced new faces at dinner parties without ever acknowledging her, or when houseguests assumed she didn't speak English and left crumbs in her path. She simply worked, and in her quiet way, she bore witness to everything. There was something sacred about silence. Clarice had learned that in childhood, when noise often meant chaos. Here the quiet was different. Oppressive, yes, but also orderly. That order was her domain. The white carpets that never saw a footprint. The silver frames that held hollow smiles. The incense Mrs. Grant burned when she needed peace from her own son's tantrums. Clarice knew the rhythms of the house like a song. The dripping of the guest room faucet that maintenance never fixed. The humming buzz of Sterling's phone calls through his office door. The way Carter stomped instead of walked, when he didn't get his way. But that morning, the one this story begins on, something felt off. Not loud, just out of tune. Clarice felt it as she reached for the drawer under the stovetop, the one that never quite shut all the way. The air was cooler than usual. The silence, heavy. She glanced toward the hallway leading to the study, where Sterling kept his personal items, watches, medals, even a miniature sculpture made of rare ivory that had always unnerved her. The door was slightly ajar. Still, she moved on. There was a rhythm to respect. She washed the linens upstairs. She opened the blinds in each bedroom to let in the soft blush of morning sun. She passed by the mirror in the upstairs hall and caught her reflection. Tired eyes, calm face, unreadable. She hadn't aged much, people said, but time doesn't mark everyone on the outside. By 8 a.m., the estate had begun to stir. The espresso machine hissed like a serpent. Carter clomped into the kitchen, too old for tantrums but still entitled to them. He barely glanced at Clarice. She offered him his usual plate, golden waffles with strawberries shaped into hearts. He didn't say thank you. Sterling came down 20 minutes later. Crisp shirt, jaw clean-shaven, watch gleaming. His face was practiced, a smile fitted like a tailored suit, but something in his eyes was unreadable, even for her. He paused at the kitchen counter, glanced toward the den, then turned sharply to Clarice. "Did you move anything from my study?" he asked, tone flat but cold. The question hung there like smoke. Clarice blinked. "No, sir." He didn't nod, didn't move. He just stared for a second too long, then turned away. At 9:12 a.m., Clarice gathered her cleaning supplies, placed them in the hall closet, and made her way out. She left through the back entrance as always, quiet as the wind. She didn't know what was missing. She didn't know why Sterling's voice had sounded just a little too measured, but she felt it, the shift, the imbalance. The house on Hawthorne Ridge had always been a place of unspoken codes and silent servitude. But that morning, as the clouds broke above the estate and sun carved light across the polished floors, something had changed. And though Clarice could not yet name it, she knew, some houses don't creak before they crumble. Some fall in silence. And this house was about to get very loud. Sterling Grant lived his life like a campaign ad. Perfectly curated, flawlessly lit, always a step ahead of the questions no one dared to ask. His smile was his signature, white, wide, and persistent. It graced magazine covers, corporate brochures, TED Talks about compassionate capitalism. At 46, he had built an empire on wearable tech, using sleek packaging and visionary language to sell luxury as lifestyle. But what people didn't know, what they were never meant to know, was that behind that smile lived a man who never forgot his place in the pyramid, and who made damn sure everyone else remembered theirs. His home was a reflection of that doctrine. Precision landscaping, minimalist interior, silent appliances, and a security system so advanced it could identify a falling leaf by sound. Sterling liked order. He liked things where he left them, liked being in control even when pretending to delegate. And he especially liked people who knew how to stay in the background. People like Clarice Holden. For 17 years, Clarice had floated through the estate, like a breath of warm air, reliable, steady, invisible in the way service workers were expected to be. Sterling appreciated her that way. She did her job without comment, never inserted herself into conversations, and knew better than to ask personal questions. He never learned her grandchildren's names, never asked about her bus route when the roads iced over. He didn't have to. He paid her on time, gave the occasional holiday bonus, and nodded in her direction at Christmas dinners. That was enough, in his mind. That was kindness. But things changed the day Sterling realized the ivory figure, the one sculpted from rare Angolan tusk and passed down through 3 generations of Grant men, was gone. He discovered the empty pedestal mid-morning, sunlight slanting across the polished hardwood, the security system flashing green, as always. The air in the study tightened. He walked around the vacant space once, twice, staring at it as though willing the figure to reappear. Then he opened his phone, checked the security footage, hours of nothing but filtered stillness and routine motion. No alerts, no triggered sensors, no explanation. But the artifact was gone. Sterling stood very still. For a man who controlled boardrooms, media optics and billion-dollar negotiations, this was unacceptable. He didn't rage. He didn't shout. He simply narrowed his eyes and began to narrow his options. The cleaner came in, Tuesdays and Thursdays. The landscapers never entered the house. His wife was in Santa Barbara with her yoga retreat, and Carter had been grounded last week for crashing his e-scooter into the Lexus. Clarice. The name floated up like steam. She had access. She'd been in the study before. She had even dusted that exact shelf on more than one occasion. Sterling remembered because she always moved the figure exactly half an inch to the left, aligning it with the edge of the frame beside it. A thought crept into his mind. Not a conclusion, not a certainty, just an idea. But in Sterling's world, suspicion was enough to act. Evidence could be crafted later. Context could be sold. At precisely 1:00 p.m., with the house staged for a scheduled leadership brunch, Sterling made the decision. He didn't pull Clarice aside in private. He didn't request a conversation in the study. No, he waited until the guests had arrived. Venture capitalists, product engineers, a local senator's assistant, and made the accusation in the presence of them all, calmly. With a smile, he simply said, "It seems one of our family heirlooms has gone missing. We're investigating all possibilities, of course. But some hands have had more access than others." Clarice stood near the coffee tray, pouring espresso into bone-white cups. She did not react. Her shoulders remained square, eyes neutral. But the silence that followed was volcanic. Eyes turned toward her, subtle, some pretending not to look. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The weight of the moment sank like a stone into the room's polished elegance. Sterling did not name her directly. That would have been gauche. But the implication spread like oil on marble. Clarice was the only employee present, the only black person in the room, the only one without a title or a tailored suit. That made her easy. That made her expendable. Within the hour, she was asked not to return until further notice. No charges filed, no questions asked, just a procedural dismissal. Sterling didn't escort her out himself. That would have suggested accountability. Instead, he spoke with charm to a group of investors about transparency and trust, while Clarice quietly gathered her things and stepped out into the late autumn sun. He never called her name again. He never followed up with law enforcement, never updated the staff, never filed a claim on the insurance. He didn't need to. The accusation had done its work. The object was missing, and a scapegoat had been chosen. The optics were intact, and Sterling could smile again. But beneath that manufactured ease, something had shifted. A low hum began to build around the story. Small murmurs among neighbors, glances exchanged at grocery store checkouts, a church bulletin that suddenly mentioned Clarice's years of service with quiet honor. Sterling noticed the shift, and tried to ignore it. Still, he checked the study door twice a night. He reviewed the footage again and again, as though this time it might reveal something different. The empty pedestal haunted him, not because of what it represented, but because it refused to stay buried. Sterling Grant was a man who had always built his world on perception. But perception, like heirlooms, could vanish without warning, and what replaced it was often far more dangerous than he imagined. Because out beyond the edge of his gated estate, someone else had heard the whisper, and this time, someone was listening. The streets of Ashbridge Hollow weren't built for noise. They thrived on restraint, trimmed hedges, lawn ornaments with seasonal taste, casual smiles at the mailbox, and fences just high enough to separate civility from intimacy. But nothing traveled faster through that neighborhood than a half-told story. By the afternoon following her dismissal, Clarice's name had already folded itself into the breeze. It moved with the same subtlety she had mastered. The pause in conversation at the dry cleaners, the slightly longer look from the grocery clerk, the unreturned wave from a neighbor she'd helped during a power outage 3 winters ago. The accusation didn't need confirmation. It needed only suggestion. That was enough for suspicion to take root. Clarice didn't cry. She made cornbread that night, like she always did on Tuesdays. She scrubbed her sink twice, sat on the front porch with a quilt over her knees, and watched the sky turn from gray to gold, to deep blue. Her grandchildren played with sidewalk chalk beside her. She didn't mention the accusation to them. She wouldn't give it that power. Instead, she asked them about school, helped them trace flowers in pink and green, and laughed at a joke that barely made sense. Inside her, though, something ached. Not from guilt. She had none, but from betrayal without confrontation. Sterling hadn't asked, hadn't investigated, hadn't spoken to her like a person. He had simply turned her into a cautionary tale and let the silence do the rest. By Wednesday, her phone had stopped ringing. The church coordinator postponed her volunteer shift, just until things settle. A woman from the congregation texted, "Thinking of you," with a heart emoji, but never followed up. The distance was almost comical in its choreography. People were careful not to accuse, yet made their absence speak loudly. Her name, once said with casual familiarity, now hovered like static. Even the mailman averted his gaze when placing envelopes in her box. Clarice noticed everything. She noticed the school secretary who hesitated when she came to pick up her granddaughter early. She noticed the local librarian, usually so chatty, who now offered only a mechanical, "Have a good day." Even at the market where she'd once been greeted with warmth and familiarity, the cashier's smile had become too polite, too quick, her receipt handed over like a burden. It wasn't outright hostility. It was worse. It was polite suspicion, the kind that masked itself in civility while letting the rot grow underneath. Clarice had lived long enough to recognize it. She had grown up in it, seen it simmer behind closed doors and beneath well-pressed collars. The lie wasn't that racism had disappeared. The lie was that it wore different clothes now. The real wound wasn't the accusation itself. It was the absence of protest. The people who didn't speak up. The silence of those who knew her character but opted for neutrality. In Ashbridge Hollow, neutrality was just a quieter form of betrayal. She turned inward in the days that followed. She cleaned her own house with the same care she gave Sterling's. She took long walks early in the morning, before the gossip could rise with the sun. She prayed before bed, not for vindication, but for stillness, for protection, for wisdom in the waiting. Each night she checked the lock on her front door twice, not out of fear but from habit. And still she held her head high. She did not shrink. But the shift had begun. Her grandson overheard something on the playground. Another child whispering that his grandma got fired for stealing. The words reached Clarice through the soft voice of a 7-year-old trying not to cry. She hugged him longer that night, told him that people often fear what they don't understand, told him the truth always breathes, even when it's buried. She didn't try to explain injustice. She let the warmth of her arms do the talking. At the same time, whispers started curling in the opposite direction too, quieter, more questioning. A former neighbor mentioned that Clarice once helped organize a neighborhood food drive. A teacher recalled she'd volunteered every semester to read to the kids. A retired gardener, who used to work for the grants, told someone at the barbershop that Clarice once paid for his lunch when his check bounced, and never brought it up again. Those murmurs didn't travel as quickly as the accusation, but they began to hum beneath the surface. A friction had formed. People who'd never questioned Sterling Grant began to remember how fast the story had spread, how little it had been questioned. There was no evidence, no police report, no press release, just a missing statue and a single insinuation. Clarice didn't know any of that. She didn't see the slow unraveling of narrative behind closed doors. She didn't hear the minister who slipped her name back into the Sunday service, or the grocery manager who quietly told the cashier, "You be respectful to that woman." She didn't witness the barbershop debates, or the looks exchanged at the HOA meeting when someone brought up the incident. But she felt the shift in the wind. It came one morning when her doorbell rang, and she opened it to find Lucille O'Neill standing there. The matriarch of one of the most respected families in town, tall and commanding even in her 60s, with a church hat perched like a crown, and eyes that didn't flinch. Lucille didn't ask if the rumors were true. She didn't need to. She brought sweet potato pie and quiet solidarity. She said, "We see you." And that was enough. Clarice invited her in. Outside, the wind carried whispers in every direction. But inside, in the Holden home, truth sat quietly, waiting. It was during a quiet Tuesday evening service at New Light Baptist Church that Lucille O'Neill first heard the whisper drift across the pews, not in the sermon, not in any spoken prayer, but in the side glances and heavy silences of the congregation. The kind of tension that filled a room when injustice slipped in wearing a well-pressed suit. Lucille sat near the front, where she always did, her spine straight, her eyes sharp. She didn't need to hear the whole story to understand its weight. She knew the sound of a good woman's name being dragged through back channels, and she didn't let it sit. After the benediction, she waited near the coat rack, her purse resting against her hip, until Clarice stepped into view. They hadn't spoken in months, just nods exchanged across fellowship meals, and gentle hellos on church steps. But Clarice's face that night was different. Composed, but distant, wounded but too proud to flinch. Lucille approached, not with pity but with presence, and she asked one question. "You all right, baby?" Clarice didn't lie. She didn't spill. She simply said, "I didn't take nothing." And that was enough. Lucille knew what it meant to be accused without evidence, especially when your skin made you guilty by default. She squeezed Clarice's hand once, firm and wordless. Then she got in her car and made one call. Shaquille O'Neal was sitting in his Atlanta home, scrolling through a community grant proposal, when his phone lit up with Mom. He answered on the first ring. "Shaquille, baby." Lucille said, "Who's even but taught. You remember Clarice Holden?" Shaq blinked, sitting upright. The name slid into his chest like a memory long sealed. "Of course I remember her. She used to give me lunch when I was too proud to ask." Lucille told him everything. Not dramatized. Just facts. Clarice accused of theft by her employer. No proof. No police. But plenty of whispers. Suspended. Silenced. Shunned. Lucille didn't need to say more. Shaq listened. And when she finished there was a long pause. Not the kind that hung in hesitation, but the kind that settled in purpose.
"I got it," he said.
The following Sunday the Holden house stirred early. Clarice was standing at the stove, stirring oatmeal with brown sugar and nutmeg for the kids, her eyes flicking to the window every so often. She wasn't expecting company, but something tugged at her ribs, the strange weight of being watched by a world that now questioned her integrity. She tried to shake it off, tried to keep the house moving, and then the knock came. Not sharp, not urgent, just 3 measured taps against the wooden door. Clarice wiped her hands on her apron and opened it slowly. There, standing in the morning light, wearing a hoodie that didn't try to hide his 7'1" frame, and holding 2 full bags of groceries, was Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal. He didn't say much, just a soft, hey, like they'd seen each other yesterday. Clarice blinked, momentarily stunned by the sheer scale of him in her doorway. The man who'd become legend now holding a bag of cereal and orange juice with reverence. Didn't know what the kids liked, he said gently. So I brought both Fruity Pebbles and Frosted Flakes. Clarice moved aside without a word. He stepped in carefully, ducking beneath the low frame, and set the bags on the kitchen counter. The kids stared from the hallway, wide-eyed and whispering behind their fingers. Shaq winked at them, then turned to Clarice. I heard what happened, and I want you to know, I got you. Clarice didn't cry. She just reached for a grocery bag, quietly unloading it, like it was the most natural thing in the world. For a moment the room held its breath, the juxtaposition of scandal and sanctuary hanging in the air. Then she smiled, soft and slow, and nodded once. Shaq stayed for breakfast. He folded his legs awkwardly under the kitchen table and told the kids stories about his own childhood. Not the NBA years, but the in-between moments. The nights when hunger made you creative. The afternoons when Clarice handed him a sandwich and never asked where his mama was. She didn't make it a big thing, he said. She just fed me. That's the kind of person she is. After the meal, Shaq pulled a small leather notebook from his coat pocket and began jotting down names. I want every detail, he told her. Every shift you worked. Any cameras in that house. Who else came in or out. Anything that don't sit right. I want it all. Clarice hesitated, then poured him coffee and began. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. Just laid out the days as they happened. The routines, the glances, the subtle shift in Sterling's tone. The day he made the accusation. Shaq listened without interrupting. His expression calm but his fingers tightening around the coffee mug every time a new slight surfaced. He didn't say, we'll fix this. That wasn't his style. He knew the world didn't hand out apologies easily, especially not to black women who made themselves too easy to ignore. But he also knew power, and how to redirect it. Before he left, Shaq stood in the doorway and looked her in the eye. They're not gonna get away with this. Not this time. Clarice nodded. She believed him. As he stepped outside, neighbors across the street peeked from their windows. They recognized him immediately. The man with a face from television, now casually walking out of Clarice Holden's house like he belonged there, and he did. His presence alone was a statement, a line drawn in the dust. By Monday, the community buzz had shifted. Shaq's visit became the news story. People whispered, wondered, was he here just to support or to expose? Sterling's name started to reappear in conversations, not as a pillar of prestige, but as a man under an unspoken question mark. The story had found new legs, and this time it wasn't being controlled from behind a gated estate. Shaq began making calls. Not press calls, not lawyers yet, just quiet conversations with people who still owed him favors. Security consultants, civil rights advocates, retired investigators who respected discretion. He wasn't loud, he wasn't fast, but every move was measured. Because this wasn't just about Clarice, it was about what her story represented. And Shaq knew, more than most, what it meant to grow up in a world where a whisper could become a weapon, or a torch. This time he chose fire. Shaquille O'Neal never rushed things that mattered. On the court maybe, but in life, especially when it came to injustice, he knew the importance of patience. It wasn't just about power, it was about positioning. And in Clarice Holden's case, the truth wasn't going to shout, it would whisper buried beneath protocol and pretense. In the quiet corners of a world built to erase people like her, without leaving fingerprints. So Shaq started where he always did, in the detail. He went back to the Grant estate, not physically, but through blueprints and system audits. He had a guy, Langston, who used to work cybersecurity for private luxury estates in Miami. Now semi-retired, Langston owed Shaq a favor from a charity incident, long forgotten by the public. Within 48 hours, Shaq had the specs of the estate's security infrastructure, including the smart surveillance system Sterling Grant bragged about in every interview. On paper, it was flawless. Smart locks, biometric sensors, motion-activated cameras in every hall. But technology rarely lied. It just needed the right interpreter. Langston noticed something odd. There was a 10-minute gap in the log on the night before the heirloom was discovered missing. Not a blackout, not a system crash, a manual override. Someone had paused recording in one wing of the house, specifically, near the private study where the ivory sculpture had been displayed. Shaq didn't jump to conclusions. Gaps could be maintenance errors. He'd seen rich people forget to update their firmware and lose entire weeks of footage. But the pause happened at 2:03 a.m. on a Tuesday, a time Clarice never worked and had no access to the house. That mattered. It meant someone with access credentials or inside connections had made that decision. He wrote it down. Red underlined. Manual override. 2:03 a.m. No Clarice. Next, Shaq turned to people. Not press. People. Those who cleaned, delivered, repaired. The ones who saw the house from the inside out without ever being seen. He found Nina, a cleaner from a different agency, one that sent backup help to the Grant estate every third Thursday for deep sanitization. She didn't recognize Clarice at first, until Shaq mentioned the church, the kids, the cornbread. Then she remembered. Her tone changed, softened. Nina didn't know about the accusation. Nobody had told her anything. But she remembered something from 2 months prior. She'd been polishing fixtures in the hallway outside the study when she heard voices. Sterling, and another man, not Carter. Someone older, more agitated. She didn't catch names, but the argument was tense, about money, lost trust, and something being moved, before anyone notices. She hadn't thought anything of it. Rich folks had secrets, she assumed. But now it clicked differently. Shaq pressed gently. Did she see the man's face? Only briefly, in reflection. White, late 30s, wearing a navy suit with a silver cufflink. That too she remembered. It had the initials DG. Shaq wrote that down too. DG witnessed arguing with Sterling. Date confirmed. Back in his truck, Shaq replayed the study's layout in his mind. He'd been in the house years ago. A Christmas charity auction. He remembered the hallway's curvature, the soft lighting, the glass display case like an altar in the corner, the kind of place that made people believe objects mattered more than people. Then came the wine bottle. It surfaced during a visit with Lawrence, a quiet chain-smoking former landscaping contractor, who'd handled the Grant property for 4 years, before being replaced by a private firm. They met at a diner just off the highway, neutral Grant. Lawrence looked nervous, tugging at his sleeves and watching the door. He remembered seeing a wine bottle, half buried in the hedgerows 3 days after the news about Clarice broke. That alone wasn't odd, but it was vintage, a bottle Sterling would never throw out casually. Lawrence kept it, out of spite more than curiosity. When he handed it over, Shaq noticed the faint print along the neck. Smudged, but he had the bottle tested discreetly. Not through official channels, through a local lab technician who respected what Shaq called under-the-table justice. A week later, the results came back. Partial fingerprint. Not Clarice's, not Sterling's, but the print matched a man named Dominic Graves, a former hedge fund associate, linked to Sterling's early ventures and quietly buried after a 2020 embezzlement scandal. Shaq pieced it together. Dominic had been in that house, likely that night, likely without being logged. The security pause, probably intentional, the wine, a nervous tell. He could feel the narrative shifting. This wasn't theft. This was a cover-up. Someone moved the heirloom to conceal a bigger transaction. Maybe sold it. Maybe offered it as collateral. But the easiest way to distract from a breach, blame someone who couldn't afford to fight back. Still, Shaq knew truth alone wouldn't be enough. Tower protected itself. The more he dug, the more resistance he felt. Sterling's legal team had begun whispering about character evaluations and background reviews. Someone from the Grant Foundation called to ask if Shaq really wanted to involve himself in something this messy. Even a local business partner hinted that aligning with Clarice might not be good for optics. That only made him double down. He met with Clarice again, this time with folders, timelines, images. She didn't flinch, as he laid it all out. The override log, the testimony, the fingerprint. She just nodded slowly, eyes tracing the arc of a story too familiar. They were building something now. Brick by brick, quiet, but undeniable. What they had wasn't a smoking gun. It was something harder to ignore. A pattern, inconsistencies, a motive, and a refusal to back down. Sterling had underestimated her. But worse, he had underestimated the network that held her up. People like Lucille, people like Shaq, people who saw her not as a liability, but as the living proof of how often dignity was punished in silence. Shaq stood at the edge of the evidence board, arms crossed, eyes heavy with resolve. The details weren't glamorous. They wouldn't make headlines, but truth lived in the overlooked spaces. The timestamp no one checked, the whisper overheard by the wrong person, the print left behind in the dark. Truth hid in those places because it knew someone like him would go looking. And Shaq wasn't done digging. She lived on the edge of town, tucked into a small white bungalow shadowed by trees that grew too close to the siding. Her porch sagged slightly near the steps, but her wind chimes still sang clearly in the breeze. Her name was Delphine Monroe, and though she hadn't spoken Sterling Grant's name in 3 years, she knew exactly why Shaquille O'Neal was standing at her front door. She didn't answer right away. The screen door creaked open only halfway, her eyes peeking out from behind layers of caution and memory. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked tired, the kind of fatigue that lingers long after the storm has passed, but the debris remains untouched. "You're here for him, aren't you?" she asked, her voice neither bitter nor warm. "Just certain." Shaq nodded, respectful. "I'm here for the woman he tried to bury." Delphine studied him for a long moment, then slowly unlatched the door. She stepped aside, motioned toward the couch without speaking. He ducked under the low doorway, stepping into a home that smelled of lemon balm and quiet resistance. The living room was lined with stacked books and journals, no TV in sight, just silence wrapped in layers of old secrets. She offered him tea but didn't wait for an answer before placing the kettle on the stove. As it hissed to life, she leaned against the counter, arms folded. Her hair was short now, gray curling into her temples, but her presence was sharp, like someone who'd been dismissed too often and learned to carry herself like a blade. "I was his assistant for 5 years, she began, longer than most lasted. Shaq sat quietly, letting her shape the space. She didn't ramble. She measured her words like someone still haunted by how they were once used against her. "People think he's clever," she said, "but Sterling doesn't outsmart people. He isolates them. He makes sure everyone who works for him feels like they're lucky to be near him. And when they stop feeling that way, he replaces them." She glanced over, gauging Shaq's expression. Calm, focused. She nodded and continued. "I signed an NDA," she said flatly, "but that was before I understood how many of us there were. I was the third woman in his office to walk away with silence written into a check." Shaq's fingers tightened around his knee, but he said nothing. "He doesn't just protect himself. He builds a world where he can't be touched. The Grant Foundation, the think pieces, the photo ops with disadvantaged youth. It's all a wall. So when he points a finger, no one asks questions, especially if the target isn't part of his world." She handed Shaq the tea and sat across from him, the table between them covered in old mail and unopened journals. Her voice dropped a notch. "I heard about Clarice," she said, "and I knew instantly it wasn't about some stolen statue. That man doesn't care about artifacts. He cares about distraction. If something was taken, it was to cover something else. Probably financial. He's been circling bankruptcy for years, keeps moving assets, burning relationships, pivoting companies like clockwork." Shaq leaned forward slightly, his voice even. "Did you see anything back then?" Delphine hesitated. Her eyes flicked to a drawer near the wall, then back to Shaq. He had a drawer of files labeled failsafes. It wasn't just backups. It was leverage, dirt on partners, screenshots, recordings. "I only saw it once, when he was on the phone yelling about someone threatening a leak. He said, and I quote, 'They'll never speak. They all know I have insurance.'" She let the words sit there. Shaq exhaled slowly, the gravity sinking in. "So Clarice, she's just another piece?" Delphine shook her head. "No. She's the scapegoat. Sterling needs a villain whenever he feels a crack forming, and it's always someone quieter than him, someone who can't fight back." Her fingers drummed the table once before she stood. From the drawer she had glanced at, she pulled a folder, thin, yellowed. She placed it in front of him. "After I left, I started keeping my own files," she said. "It's not much, copies of emails, notes, timelines. But it might help. There's a contact in there too, someone from his finance team who ghosted after a payout dispute. She may know more." Shaq opened the folder, flipping through sheets of tight handwriting, dated logs, scanned letters, and one particularly damning memo. Sterling requesting deletion of specific donor files for a tax-exempt subsidiary under investigation. This was no longer about an accusation. This was about a structure built on manipulation, where Clarice's humiliation was just a single thread in a much wider web. Shaq looked up at Delphine, deeply moved. You didn't have to hold on to this, she shrugged. Maybe not. But someone needed to remember. And if Clarice's name is what finally cracks that house open, then I'm not staying quiet anymore. They sat in silence for a beat, the room swelling with shared purpose. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the window, carrying the weight of what had yet to be uncovered. As Shaq stood to leave, Delphine followed him to the door. He'll try to spin this, she said. He always does. But if you're going to bring the truth forward, don't just expose him, show the pattern. Shaq nodded, the folder clutched firmly in his hand. I will. He stepped out into the fading afternoon light, his steps heavy but sure. The evidence was growing. So was the resistance. And with Delphine's quiet bravery now added to the chorus, the narrative Sterling had so carefully constructed was beginning to shake at its foundation. Because secrets, no matter how deep they're buried, don't stay silent forever. The day began quietly, with the sun casting a gentle gleam across the Holden porch. A white tent had been erected on the lawn, modest but elegant, lined with folding chairs and flower arrangements that whispered dignity rather than spectacle. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the edge of the driveway, clipboard in hand, surveying the setup like a man preparing for something far bigger than a fundraiser. To the casual eye, it looked like a neighborhood charity brunch, nothing more. A food drive, a community check-in, a casual press opportunity featuring one of the city's most visible philanthropists. But this wasn't a fundraiser. It was a reckoning dressed in soft linen and catered pastries. Shaq had planned every detail. No podium, no flashy banners. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle, intimate and deliberate, facing a modest stage made of wooden pallets covered with a single cream tablecloth. It gave the illusion of openness while framing the moment for exactly what it was, a stage with just enough gravity to shift public perception. Invitations had gone out to a very specific list, not the press circuit, but local journalists with integrity, lawyers who'd fought institutional bias, community organizers, church leaders, and 2 members of the city council, with a record of quietly challenging elite misconduct. The story until now had lived in whispers, but this was the hour it would be named. Clarice Holden sat on the porch steps, dressed in her Sunday best, not flashy, not apologetic, just clean and proud. Her hands were folded gently in her lap, her face calm, not hard, not angry, just composed. She hadn't asked for this, hadn't campaigned to be anyone's symbol. But when Shaq told her what was coming, she didn't resist. She showed up. That in itself was a declaration. Sterling Grant arrived at exactly 11:14 a.m., his black SUV curling into the street with smooth precision. His assistant had RSVP'd on his behalf, noting that Mr. Grant was happy to support local community efforts, especially those involving Mr. O'Neal. He stepped out in a navy blazer and pale blue shirt, the collar open, his posture relaxed, the embodiment of controlled charm. If he suspected anything, it didn't show. His eyes scanned the small crowd, lips curved into that signature grin. He shook hands with a councilwoman, clapped a local reverend on the back, then looked toward Shaq with an air of polite detachment. Shaq greeted him with the same civility. No theatrics, just eye contact and a short nod. Glad you made it, he said. Sterling chuckled. Wouldn't miss it. The guests were seated by 11:30. A soft hum of conversation filled the space. No one quite knew what was about to happen. That was part of the design. The subtle tension threaded through the air like static before a storm. Then Shaq stepped onto the makeshift platform, microphone in hand, his frame filling the space without trying. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Good morning, y'all, he began. I appreciate everyone being here. I called today a charity brunch because, in a way, it is. We're here to talk about what we choose to protect in our communities and what we choose to ignore. A quiet shifted through the crowd. Some of you know the story. Some of you have only heard parts. Today you'll hear the whole thing. He turned slightly, motioning toward a small monitor that had been wheeled beside him. We'll start with a timeline. One by one, he walked the audience through the facts. Security logs from the Grant estate. Paused at 2:03 a.m., the night before the alleged theft. Witness testimony from Nina, the temporary cleaner. The fingerprint from the wine bottle, not Clarice's, but Dominic Graves, Sterling's former associate, whose name appeared in a sealed embezzlement filing years ago. And then the clincher, a brief audio file played through the monitor's speaker. Sterling's voice, unmistakable, clipped and tense, saying, They'll never speak. They know I have insurance. The room froze. No gasps. Just silence sharpened to a needlepoint. Shaq continued. Steady. Clarice Holden was accused of theft without evidence. Suspended. Silenced. Her name questioned. Her livelihood threatened. And she's not the first. He opened a second folder, citing Delphine Monroe by name, with her consent and outlining the pattern of NDAs, the quiet departures, the silenced discomforts, buried beneath Sterling's polished reputation. Then, gently, he stepped aside and looked at Clarice. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence, her posture, the fact that she sat there unflinching while her name was returned to her. It was enough. Her silence was louder than any accusation. It held everything the truth needed. Sterling's face had shifted. The smile was still there, but it no longer reached his eyes. He began to rise from his chair, only to be gently approached by a woman in a tan blazer. A lawyer, calm, quiet, carrying a clipboard of her own. "Mr. Grant," she said in a tone meant only for him, "we'll need to follow up on some of this." He nodded mechanically, his lips parting as if to object, but no sound came, not with the cameras now trained on him, not with the city council member murmuring into her phone, not with the local reporter from the Clarion already typing furiously. Shaq closed his folder and addressed the crowd one last time. "We don't always get to write the endings to stories like these, but we can choose how we respond when the truth shows up. Today we choose to believe those who've been silenced, and we choose to stop letting power rewrite reality." Applause didn't erupt. It unfolded. A slow rising wave of affirmation, not for show, but for healing. Clarice stood, not dramatically, just with poise. She looked at Shaq, nodded once, and turned to leave. The crowd parted for her, not out of pity, but respect. Sterling remained seated, flanked now by two legal aides who'd quietly appeared from the fringes. His expression was unreadable, but the veneer had cracked. The man who smiled with his teeth now sat beneath a glare not of stage lights, but and just like that, the story changed. Not because someone yelled louder, but because someone refused to stay quiet. Sterling Grant had always known how to hold a room. From early startup pitches in dusty college auditoriums, to global conferences with keynote lights trained on his every word, his presence was calibrated, a blend of disarming charm and manufactured humility, punctuated by that practiced smile. It made people lean in, made them forget to question. But now, in the wake of a single morning beneath a white tent on Holden's lawn, that very smile began to betray him. The press didn't attack at first. They hovered. Quiet headlines emerged. Soft-edged, non-committal. Concern surface over Grant Estate incident. CEO at center of private dispute. Sterling tried to maintain composure. He released a statement calling the event misguided and personal, an attempt to discredit his philanthropic efforts. But the words rang hollow. Too vague, too late. Then Delphine Monroe stepped forward. She didn't seek the cameras. They found her. A local reporter with integrity interviewed her in her own home. The same wind chimes jingling faintly behind her as she spoke. Her voice didn't shake. Her story didn't wander. She outlined her NDA, the environment she had escaped, and the network of silenced departures she'd quietly tracked for years. She named dates, patterns, payouts. She didn't speculate, she sighed. And when the clip aired during the 6 o'clock news, something in the narrative broke loose. Next came Nina, the cleaner. She hadn't meant to be part of any public wave, but after watching Delphine, she decided she couldn't stay silent. Her interview was short, less composed, but just as impactful. She recalled the overheard conversation, the initials, the late-night wine bottle. She confirmed the strange tension in Sterling's tone, weeks before the accusation. Her words weren't rehearsed, but they rang with truth, the kind that cuts through manufactured noise like sunlight. By the third day, Sterling's communications team was scrambling. Their phones buzzed with interview requests, cancellation demands, board pressure. His lawyer released a second statement, longer, more defensive, claiming a campaign of defamation orchestrated by individuals with personal vendettas. But the more they tried to control the message, the more the cracks widened. Then the footage hit. A short clip, barely 15 seconds, surfaced online. Sterling pacing in his private study, unaware the security system had reactivated, after a brief manual pause. The audio was muted, but the timestamp aligned exactly with the window Shaq had uncovered. In it, Sterling is seen handling the ivory sculpture, speaking urgently to a man, later confirmed as Dominic Graves. The sculpture is then removed from the frame. It never returned. The footage didn't show a theft. It showed intent. And in that moment, every doubt people had clung to began to dissolve. The board of directors for Grant Tech convened a private emergency session. Less than 24 hours later, Sterling Grant was suspended indefinitely from his position as CEO, pending a full internal ethics investigation. The board's statement was brief, but final. Our values must align with accountability. Sterling stood on the steps of his estate that evening, addressing a handful of reporters with cameras pointed at his eyes like searchlights. His voice was controlled, but thinner than usual, his posture still upright but defensive. He tried to claim misunderstanding, suggested a friend visiting had moved the sculpture, blamed early reporting for exaggerating events. But then someone asked about Clarice Holden, whether he regretted naming her. He hesitated, and in that pause, the whole facade began to crumble. I never, he began. But the word caught. I didn't accuse her directly. There were circumstantial reasons. The stammer was quiet, but thunderous. The man who once smiled with his teeth now floundered beneath his own words. Clarice never responded publicly. She didn't grant interviews. She didn't write posts. She let the silence remain hers, regal and immovable. Her dignity stood in contrast to the unraveling spectacle Sterling had become. Where he once crafted narratives, now the truth had seized the pen. The legal investigation was announced 2 days later on live TV. No one used the word trial, not yet, but an official inquiry into fraudulent asset transfers, misconduct in executive governance, and wrongful workplace terminations began. Clarice's name appeared in the opening line of the announcement, not as a defendant but as a subject of wrongful treatment and reputational damage. Sterling's network shrank overnight. Sponsorships vanished. The university quietly rescinded his scheduled commencement address. One of his foundations posted a black square saying, "We stand with workers." And still Clarice remained silent. She returned to her routines, not to resume the old rhythm, but to reclaim her place on her own terms. Her porch welcomed friends again. Neighbors stopped to say hello with less hesitation. Some apologized, not always in words, but with fresh-baked bread, quiet yard work help, and new invitations to Sunday dinners. It didn't erase what had happened, but it acknowledged it. Shaq visited often, not as a protector anymore, but as a friend. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they just sat, watching the street, letting the weight of what had passed breathe. "Did you think it would go this far?" Clarice asked once, her tone thoughtful. Shaq looked at her. "I hoped it would go further." She smiled, a small one. "Funny. All I wanted was for it to stop. And maybe that's what made the story so powerful." It didn't end with a verdict. It ended with exposure, with truth, dragged into the daylight, with a man whose empire had been built on silence, now forced to answer for what echoed in its absence. Sterling Grant wasn't in handcuffs. He wasn't in hiding. But his power, the real kind, the invisible kind, had thinned. He was no longer untouchable, no longer unquestioned. His face still appeared on business blogs and talk shows, but now with an asterisk, a cautionary tale sewn into his tailored lapel. In the end, the public didn't need a courtroom to decide. They'd seen enough. They'd watched the footage, heard the women, and witnessed the stillness of a woman who never asked for a platform but stood firm when the light found her. Sterling's perfect image hadn't shattered in one blow. It had cracked piece by piece, truth by truth, and now it could no longer hold its own weight. He never said it. Not in private. Not in public. Not even through the hollow diplomacy of a legal letter drafted to sound like regret. Sterling Grant, whose words once captivated boardrooms and bent press cycles to his rhythm, never spoke Clarice Holden's name again. He gave interviews, not many, and fewer as time went on, but when asked about the incident, he shifted in his seat, offered vague phrases like unfortunate misunderstandings and miscommunication during a high-stress period. When directly pressed on whether he believed Clarice had stolen anything, he smiled, shrugged and said, "Let's not relitigate things in the media." It was the kind of evasion that spoke louder than guilt. Not because it was angry or defensive, but because it was empty. A man once obsessed with precision and optics had in the end nothing to say, and the silence finally wasn't heard. Clarice never waited for an apology. By the time the scandal had reached its crescendo, She had already made peace with the idea that people like Sterling didn't see women like her as human enough to apologize to. He had used her dignity like a chess piece, moved her to distract, sacrificed her to shield his own vulnerability, and then discarded the entire board when the game turned against him. So she didn't look for closure in his voice. She found it in the spaces he had never touched, in the porch she swept each morning with unhurried grace, in the laughter of her grandchildren echoing across the front yard, in the casserole she baked and delivered to a neighbor 2 doors down, who had finally worked up the courage to say, "I'm sorry for not standing up for you." She had not asked for pity. She had not demanded restitution. But something had shifted in Ashbridge Hollow, and this time she felt it. The distance between her and the world narrowed. People saw her now, not as a scandal, not as a story, as Clarice. Miss Holden, the woman who raised 3 sons, read to elementary school children, every Thursday brought extra biscuits to the food pantry, on holidays, and never once broke even when her name was dragged through mud. She had become a symbol, not because she wanted to, but because she never let someone else define her silence. Shaq didn't let the story settle into dust either. He knew how fast the news cycle moved, how easily people forgot when the heat cooled. So he did something that would last longer than the headlines. He built something. It began as an idea, scribbled in the margins of a notepad during one of his quiet visits to Clarice's home. By the time the leaves began to brown in early autumn, the idea had a name: the Holden Dignity Fund. Its mission was focused, unflinching, to support workers wrongfully accused or dismissed due to bias, silence, or exploitation. Not just legal fees, though that mattered, but counseling, temporary housing, wage recovery, community storytelling programs to reclaim narratives lost in employer-driven spin. Shaq made the first donation. Anonymous on paper, obvious to anyone who had followed the journey. Within weeks, other names followed. A judge who'd grown up in a household where her mother worked domestic jobs. A journalist who had almost been fired for asking the wrong questions. A local business owner who confessed in his donor note, "I once let someone go on suspicion without proof. I've lived with that ever since." Clarice didn't want to be the face of anything. But when Shaq came to her with the foundation's final paperwork, he asked her permission to name it after her. "Not because of what happened to you," he said, "but because of how you walked through it." She signed without ceremony, then quietly made banana pudding for the board's first community meeting. The Holden Dignity Fund didn't change the world overnight. It didn't erase the systemic roots of suspicion, the easy comfort with which institutions discard the vulnerable. But it carved space. It gave breath to stories that had been strangled into silence. It gave language to injustice. And it gave people like Clarice the one thing they had been so often denied: presence, without performance. In town, Clarice's life returned to something resembling normal. But not quite. The church gave her a new title: community elder. Young mothers called her for advice. Teenagers waved when she passed their basketball games. The same supermarket clerk who once refused eye contact now asked if she'd try the new peach jam they were stocking. She accepted it all with the same grace she'd carried through the storm. Not with pride, with peace. Sterling faded. His corporate influence shrank to whispers. His face disappeared from cover spreads and tech panels. He didn't lose his home, not immediately. But the invitations slowed. The partnerships dried. People didn't cancel him. They outgrew him. A man without apology eventually becomes a man without audience. In the final irony, the sculpture, the so-called stolen heirloom, was never recovered. Rumors swirled. Sold offshore. Hidden to cover debts. Left behind in a private storage unit, registered under one of Sterling's shell companies. But no one really cared. The object had been Sterling's distraction, not Clarice's crime. And once the lie collapsed, it lost its way. The real artifact was never the ivory figure. It was Clarice herself. The endurance she carried, the silence she turned into defiance, the story she never needed to tell out loud, because the world eventually saw it for itself. And the most powerful part? She never stooped to anger. She never asked for applause. She never waited for the apology that never came. Because some battles are not about who wins, but who refuses to be erased. We walk past people every day, barely noticing, not because we don't care, but because noticing takes work. It demands more than a glance. It asks for attention, not just presence. And somewhere between politeness and convenience, we learn how to look without seeing. Clarice Holden was seen too late. 17 years of quiet labor. 17 years of hands wiping surfaces that weren't hers, arranging memories that didn't belong to her. Her face passed in and out of doorways like a shadow people learned to expect, but not acknowledge. And yet, she remembered everything. The birthdays, the favorite teas, the arguments behind thin walls, the children's allergies, the subtle changes in tone when Sterling's money started running thinner and his charm had to stretch farther. But even as she noticed everything, no one noticed her. Not really. Not until silence fell too hard on her shoulders. And when it did, they blamed her for how it landed. But time, when it stretches long enough, tells the truth. It was a junior associate in Sterling's investment group who uncovered the final piece, not through moral reckoning, but curiosity. An internal audit revealed a confidential transfer of personal assets to a private buyer based out of the Cayman Islands. The item listed, a handcrafted ivory sculpture traced back to the Grant lineage. The transfer had been made 3 days before the accusation. The funds wired to cover a 6-figure gambling debt Sterling had incurred in an unregistered poker club known to host high-stakes corporate games. The heirloom was never missing. It was sold, quietly, strategically, and guiltily. And in the wake of the sale, Sterling did what people like him always do. He created distance between himself and the truth. He shifted the spotlight. He summoned suspicion. And when it came time to choose where to direct it, he picked the person no one had protected. The person easy to question. The person seen every day, but never truly seen. He didn't need her to be guilty. He only needed her to be silent long enough for the transaction to pass. The associate who discovered the paper trail never went public. They didn't need to. The board had already suspended Sterling. His credibility had collapsed. But in private, the detail passed to Shaq. A quiet email, a scan of a transaction report, a final confirmation of what everyone had started to suspect, but hadn't yet proven. Shaq didn't announce it. He didn't take it to the media. He brought it to Clarice. They sat at her kitchen table, just like before, the soft scent of cornbread lingering in the air, the late afternoon sun pooling against the worn wood of the floor. He slid the paper toward her without flourish. She read it once, then again, and finally, she nodded. "I figured," she said softly. Not with bitterness. Not even surprise. Just a kind of sad clarity that comes when the lie finally stops insisting on itself. Shaq asked if she wanted to do something with it. Release a statement, send it to the lawyer. Tell the full truth now that the trail was clear. But she shook her head. What would it change? She asked. People saw him. That's what matters. He didn't argue. Because he knew she wasn't wrong. Sterling would live in the shadow of that exposure. His legacy now footnoted with failure. His smile no longer the trusted emblem of success, but a mask that people finally learned to question. Clarice had gotten more than her name back. She had reclaimed a space that had once made her invisible, and transformed it into a reminder that dignity doesn't need apology to be valid. It simply needs air. Months passed. The news cycle moved on. Another scandal. Another viral headline. But in Ashbridge Hollow, the memory lingered differently. The Holden Dignity Fund expanded into 4 counties. Clarice's story became a curriculum case in ethics classes at a nearby university. A mural was painted in the community center where Clarice once volunteered. Not of her face, but of an open window with light streaming through it. Below, a simple caption read, "See what's been overlooked." But Clarice never became an icon. She didn't run for office, didn't start a podcast. She continued being who she always was, present, grounded, and gently protective of her peace. Every evening, just after dusk, she lit a single candle in her front window. No announcement, no explanation, just the flicker of flame against glass. It became a quiet ritual. A small act with deep roots. Forgiveness, not forgetfulness. She didn't forgive Sterling for his sake. She forgave for her own. To ensure that the bitterness he tried to plant didn't take root in her. The candle was her line in the sand. Her way of saying, "I remember, but I refuse to be reduced." The neighbors noticed. At first they assumed it was decorative, seasonal, but then it stayed, through fall, through winter, through spring. Some followed suit. A few windows down, another candle, then another across the street. Not everyone, but enough. A silent chorus of solidarity that said, "We see what we once didn't." Clarice never commented on it. She didn't need to. Because this was the legacy Sterling could never claim. Not wealth, not press, not power, but presence. The kind of presence that lingers when the noise fades. The kind of presence earned in truth. The kind of presence that cannot be taken, only given. In the end, this story wasn't about a stolen sculpture. It wasn't even about a scandal. It was about the cost of dignity, the slow burn of being erased, and the quiet, powerful return of someone who refused to stay unseen. The final twist wasn't that Sterling lied. It was that he thought the truth would stay buried. And the final truth? It never did. Some stories demand more than outrage. They ask us to remember who we overlook. If this one stirred something in you, don't just move on. Let it sit. Let it change what you notice next time. Because the real power, it's in what you choose to see, and what you refuse to ignore.